World War One is really a pivotal moment in European history. It's completely transformative in the way that wars are fought, in the way that war is conducted, and in the way people experience war in life. And it's certainly a war that could have been avoided, but as it happens, it's so destructive that it really radically just redefines Europe as we know it. And so we're going to look at the kind of the causes of and the beginnings of World War One today, and it's a pretty broad overview for a really detailed and in-depth topic. So let's start and kind of look at there are a lot of reasons why World War One happens, but there are basically three major reasons: the alliance system, increased militarization of European countries, and increased competition due to colonization. And then the Balkans, the entirety of the Balkan region. So we'll kind of dive into some of those today. First, let's look at the alliance system. And it really is a new perspective on Europe, and really redraws the line of Europe and politics and military as we know it. So, and this starts out of the Franco-Prussian War, where Otto von Bismarck realizes that he needs to protect his newly formed entity of Germany, and he needs to protect it from a few things. First is French retaliation. France is very upset that they've lost this war. They've been humiliated. They're not happy. So he needs to make sure that France doesn't seek revenge, and that's of course on his western border. And on his eastern border and southern border, he's got two massive empires: the Austro-Hungarian Empire to the south and the Russians to the east. And so he needs to find a way to kind of make sure that they're not going to pose a threat to him. So Bismarck creates something called the Three Emperors League. And this will sound kind of familiar to you if you recall the Holy Alliance. But Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia create an alliance designed in part to oppose radical movements and basically to make sure that France would not invade Germany. And this is designed to protect them from external threats as well as from each other. By entering into this alliance, they don't really have to worry about each other. The problem is this collapses after only 4 years. And so it's not exactly the most effective alliance of all time, but it sets the stage for kind of different countries to shuffle around to determine where they're going to swing and throw their allegiance. So after this, Germany and Austria create a defensive alliance. So they guarantee military assistance in case either nation is invaded by Russia. So it's creating this buffer state. Germany says, hey, if we're invaded, you have to come protect us. And likewise, if Austria is invaded, we'll come help you guys out. So it's kind of designed to thwart any Russian encroachment to the west. In 1882, Italy joins this alliance, and so you start to see these moving pieces of countries joining and switching alliances in order to secure this kind of balance of power. But by doing so, Germany maintains their independence and their security, and that's really kind of the key. That's the key for Bismarck, is to maintain their security. But in response to this triple alliance, France and Russia end up forming a defensive alliance because no one wants to be left out. You don't want to be the one nation that doesn't have an alliance. Doing so will kind of leave you in a bad spot. So France and Russia form a defensive alliance, and now they've got Germany surrounded. So it's kind of this, everyone's staring at each other, waiting for the first person to make a move. And through this alliance building, there's one superpower that's kind of hanging back on the sidelines, waiting to see how everything plays out. And that's Great Britain. And they have this concept that they call their splendid isolation. It's a very British theory. An idea that because they're this island off the coast of Europe and they've got this massive overseas empire, they can be isolated from the events on the continent. And that will keep them safe. However, as kind of time moves forward and all these battles are being fought, not just in Europe, but throughout the world, and by battles I'm talking political battles and maneuvering, but then abroad, colonial wars, Britain realizes that they're going to have to develop relations with other nations in order to protect themselves and protect their global interests. So they recognize that they cannot continue to live in this splendid isolation. So they start to try and figure out whose side they will be on. and it's kind of up in the air. Although Germany and Britain eventually go to war, the Queen is actually cousins with the Kaiser at this time. They're very much related. It's part of that intermarried European culture. So it ends up kind of a toss-up, but eventually Britain decides to pursue an alliance with France, and that's in part because of some of the things Germany does. It's this major economic competition between Germany and Britain. Remember, Germany was the nation that was most industrialized after Great Britain. They were also pushing for colonies abroad and were economic competition for Britain and didn't like that. Germany began building up their navy, and you remember the navy is kind of that jewel for the British, how proud they are of it. Germany started trying to butt in on settling Anglo-French disputes in Africa, and Britain and France wanted that to be done by their own. There's some bullying by Germany being done internationally, kind of forcing things to be maneuvered and forcing people to come to the table. And then eventually they start building battleships for their navy. And so all this kind of makes Britain wary of Germany, afraid that they're going to kind of be this militaristic threat. So eventually Britain ends up joining an alliance with France. Although, interestingly enough, it's not that alliance that brings Britain into war, and we'll talk about that later. So that was the alliance system. Now let's talk about the Balkans. The Balkans are this area. It turns into Yugoslavia at some point, but it's north of Greece and kind of in southeastern Europe. And this is considered the powder keg of Europe. That is, it is one match, one spark away from absolutely blowing up. And part of that is because of this nationalism that's coursing throughout the Balkans. The Balkans had long been subjected to rule by the Austro-Hungarians and the Ottomans, and the people there hated both of them, especially Serbia. Serbia had gained their independence, but they were very much the proto-nationalist movement there. They were leading the charge against the Austro-Hungarians and the Ottomans, and they were encouraging other Balkan neighbors and other ethnicities to join them in their nationalistic push. And to further kind of, and this is just such bad diplomacy, but to further fan the flames of this nationalism, Austria ends up annexing a territory known as Bosnia-Herzegovina. And this irritates Serbia because so many of the people there are ethnically Serbs, and they are not ethnically German like the Austrians are. And so this goes against this idea of nationalism. So Serbia is demanding access to Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Austria refuses to give it to them. So there's all this frustration going on. And eventually we see the First Balkan War, which pits Greece, Serbia, and Bulgaria against the Ottoman Empire. And out of this war, the Ottoman Empire, which is considered the sick man of Europe at this time because it's such an old, weakened empire that really has kind of no... they're done at this point, essentially. And so this ends up in defeat for the Ottoman Empire, where this alliance of Greece, Serbia, and Bulgaria win. But Serbia and Bulgaria can't end up deciding who should get what territory as a result of this war. And that deals partly with Albania and Macedonia and Montenegro. And so Bulgaria turns to their old enemy, Austria-Hungary. The enemy of my enemy, which is Serbia, is suddenly my friend. And so Serbia finds itself at war against Bulgaria and Austria-Hungary. And they call on the Russians to help them, but the Russians don't do anything, at least not yet. And the spark that we see that ends up lighting this war is the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. So the Archduke Franz Ferdinand is the heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary. Okay, so he is next in line to be the king. And he's visiting Bosnia, this capital Bosnia, Sarajevo, in June of 1914. And while there, he ends up getting assassinated by a group of Serbian nationalists. And this organization is called the Black Hand, and if you ever read about this assassination, it's almost comical in the way it goes because there's so many failures, but eventually they end up succeeding in this assassination. And so Austria, of course, is livid because the heir to their throne has been killed. And so they blame Serbia. And they invade. And at this point, Russia has a defensive alliance with Serbia, which means that now, because Austria has invaded, Russia has to declare war on them. And this is where all the dominoes start to fall. So, Russia declares war on Austria, which means that both Austria and Germany have to declare war on Russia. Because Germany and Austria have declared war on Russia, France has to declare war on Germany and Austria. So all these pieces have fallen. Now, you might think that Britain has to declare war because they're allied with France, but they actually have they don't have to declare war as part of their alliance. But Britain does have a defensive alliance with Belgium, and their alliance with Belgium says that if Belgium is invaded, Britain has to come to their aid. And so Germany decides they're going to invade France through Belgium, which is just, although it's a good military strategy, it draws Britain into the war, so it's a disaster. So this invasion through neutral Belgium draws Great Britain in the war. So by the end of like 2 months, really by the end of July, all these superpowers have now entered the war. So you've got Great Britain, France, and Russia facing off against Germany and Austria-Hungary. And they're getting ready for war. And so this war starts. And it begins with the German invasion of France through Belgium. And this plan is called the Schlieffen Plan. And the idea is that Germany will swing up north to the Channel, the English Channel, and then cut down on Paris, which would essentially circumvent the French defensive lines and split the French army. And so by doing this, they think that they can quickly defeat France. And this is necessary because there's this great fear of Russia. Germany is afraid that this Russian army, once they're able to build up, will be an unstoppable force. But because Russia is so far behind, it's going to take them a while to mobilize their army. So Germany hopes that a quick strike against France will neutralize them and allow them to focus on Russia. And that is the Schlieffen Plan. And it works with like stunning success at first, to the point where the German army is on the outskirts of Paris and crushing down towards Paris. But for some odd reason, the German army makes a turn back towards the German border. And by doing this, it leaves them slightly exposed. And so then we have a really important battle known as the Battle of the Marne, which is a river just kind of not too far away from Paris. And it begins on September 6th, 1914. So again, all of this happens really fast. And there's just this great moment where the people of Paris commandeer all the taxis in Paris to shuttle soldiers to the front lines to fight this battle. And the French are barely able to hold off, and they deflect the German advance and hold them still. And this Battle of the Marne is critically important to saving France from falling to Germany. And as a result of this, we get to what everyone knows about World War I, which is trench warfare. And this is all along the Western Front, running pretty much pretty much all the way from the English Channel to the border of Switzerland. There are trenches dug on either side facing each other with no man's land in the middle. Defenders in these trenches have barbed wire, mines, and machine guns to defend themselves. And because of this slaughter in trench warfare, not much territory is ever gained. You have this really just brutal system where people are called to go up over the trench, run a few hundred yards across no cover to try and storm the enemy trench. And of course they're mowed down by machine gun fire. And so we see just enormous casualties. And another contributing factor to these casualties are the use of chemical weapons. They're used for the first time in warfare, mustard gas and chlorine, which is just vicious, the things that it does to people. It basically burns the inside of your lungs, it blisterizes them, and then those blisters pop, and then you end up drowning in your own body fluids. And so it's pretty horrific, the sort of things these chemical weapons do. Now, with that said, they aren't exactly super effective because there's a thing called wind that pushes these chemicals across no man's land and sometimes back at the army that had fired them. And so that's what's going on the Western Front. Lots of trench warfare, lots of artillery being lobbed, chemical weapons, machine guns, people dying in massive numbers. And two of the major battles that are worth noting is the Battle of the Somme, which was fought in the summer of 1916. This is declared a victory for France and Britain, but 600,000 people, 600,000 French and British soldiers are either killed or wounded, and the front lines move 7 miles. So maybe a victory, but it's a Pyrrhic victory if it is one. And then the Battle of Verdun happens almost at the same time. In this battle, 700,000 people are killed. 700,000 French and British soldiers are killed, and nothing changes. So you have just huge casualty numbers, and this war is just a gruesome reality for these young men who are sent to die in these trenches, and no land is being gained. And not just die from battle, but disease is rampant. They're getting trench foot. All sorts of horrific things are happening to them. And life in this is miserable. And at the end of the day, there's no territory being gained on either side. So they're stuck in this stalemate of trenches with army officers still sending their young men over the tops of the trenches to die. On the Eastern Front, this massive army that everyone was so afraid of in Russia is quicker to mobilize than expected, but is also unbelievably inept. And they suffer two very quick defeats, one at Tannenberg, it's a forest, and the other at Masurian Lake. And by September of 1914, they're pretty much on the retreat away from Germany. And part of this, and we'll look at it more when we talk about the Russian Revolution, but a big part of this is just a lack of supplies. So Russia is sending soldiers in, and they're sending them to war without guns. Like, okay, the guy in front of you has a gun, and so follow him, and when he dies, you can use his gun. But until then, you have nothing to defend yourself with. So this Russian army is really outgunned, that's for sure. They're not outmanned. They have lots of men. In fact, in 1915, they lose 2.5 million of them, and they still keep coming. But they don't have guns, and that's a problem in this war. On the Eastern Front, you also have Austria-Hungary struggling with the Serbian army, which was backed by Russia. Eventually, German intervention helps them to repulse the Russians and turn them back. And so Austria-Hungary and Germany actually takes the offensive to Russia and pushes pretty far into Russia. But this is not just a European war, this is a world war. So let's talk about how this war expands. Very quickly, in the beginning of the war, the Ottoman Empire joins the Central Power. That is in 1914. They join Germany and Austria-Hungary. So now we have three major powers, or at least large empires, that are on one side. And the next year, in May of 1915, Italy joins the Triple Entente, and that's Great Britain, France, and Russia. They do this because they're promised land from Austria by helping. And we recall, this is not, this is a mere 40 years after Italian unification. They still want more land from Austria. It's not that long ago that they were taking land from Austria. So the Italians join in. Of course, the Italian-Austrian border, that war is a disaster. It's shambles. The Italians fight. They attack the same place 3 times. They continue to fail. But eventually, I guess, succeed. Although I wouldn't call what they did success. At the same time, one of the most important events in my mind in European history that's often glossed over occurs during this time, and that is a massive genocide against the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire. There's a systemic attempt to exterminate the Armenian population, culminating in over 1 million deaths, forced marches, men shot, women and children sold into slavery. It's truly a horrific crime. The Turks refuse to acknowledge it as a genocide, but most nations in the world have done so. In fact, the term genocide comes out of a study of this event. It's an intentional effort to eradicate the Armenians. And although the Turks call it a massacre or an atrocity, most historians who are not paid by the Turks, would argue that it's definitely a genocide. And the war expands to the Middle East because that's where the Ottoman Empire is. I want you to think globally real quick. Britain has a couple colonies that border up very closely to the Ottoman Empire in Egypt and in India. So this war expands very quickly to the Middle East, where the Ottomans are dragged into this long, protracted war. And the British try to strike at the heartland of the Ottoman Empire, and they launch something called the Gallipoli campaign. Gallipoli is a peninsula right near Constantinople, or Istanbul as it's known now. And their idea is that if they can capture the capital of the Ottoman Empire, it will quickly fall. This is met with complete disaster. It is trench warfare, but the British forces, who are mostly Anzac troops, Australian and New Zealand troops, are soundly defeated, and it really is kind of this horrific memory for them. So traditional warfare fails against the Ottomans, but the British have kind of an ace up their sleeve, and that is a young army officer named T.E. Lawrence, who's better known as Lawrence of Arabia, who rallies the Arab tribes to cause an Arab uprising against the Ottoman Empire, and because of this, helps to kind of tie down the Ottoman army and allows British regulars from Egypt to also deliver a defeat against the Ottomans. So, as I said, it also includes the rest of the world. European countries use their colonies for supplies and soldiers. So soldiers from all over, from Asia, from Australia, from Africa, are showing up to fight in this war. They're also using them as supplies. Japan had been an ally of Great Britain for a while now, and so during this they seize German colonies in the Pacific and take land over in China. And this sets up for Japan's continued imperial ambition that we will see continue through World War II. And eventually, the war drags the United States into it. And this happens kind of because of, well, it's kind of Germany's fault, really. So at the beginning of the war, Britain and France had established a blockade to stop supplies from reaching the Central Powers. And this is dubious whether this is legal, but they do it. And so they have this established, and the Americans don't particularly like it, but they're fine with it. It doesn't really matter. So Germany responds by using a new weapon, submarines, to sink any ships transporting goods that can be used for war. And so this takes everyone aback because it's so ungentlemanly, it's so horrific, and it leads to lots of sinking of ships and really lots of death. And one of the most famous ones is in May of 1945. The Germans sink a passenger ship named the Lusitania. This kills more than 1,000 people, including 139 Americans. This earns strong condemnation from the President, Woodrow Wilson, and from Congress. But, I mean, and it's wrong. It's wrong. But the Lusitania was carrying weapons and ammunition. This is what the Triple Entente would do, is they would kind of hide these war materials in passenger ships as a way to try and fake out the Germans. So, fearing the United States entering the war, Germany stops these actions for a couple years. They say, okay, we're not going to just use our submarines to sink ships willy-nilly, we'll stop. And so the United States continues its isolationist bend. But 2 years later, in 1917, Germany declares that they are going to resume unrestricted submarine warfare, which means that they will sink any ship that they see, regardless of if it's a passenger ship or a cargo ship. It's basically using terror and total war. And so because of this, the United States declares that they will enter the war, and that gets us right up towards the close of World War I, which we'll look at a little more closely later on.